Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Back during the summer, Jeff Guenther, who is the host of the podcast Say More About That, interviewed me on his podcast, and it was such a great interview that I asked Jeff if he'd be willing to share the file with me. There is a little bit of an issue with the buffering on my end. Again, I apologize. I've done everything that I can. It's not horrible, but it could be better. There are a couple of things in this episode. Jeff asks me if I had a client that came to me who was highly sensitive, would I help them accept their sensitivity or would I help them develop more resilience? Jeff did a beautiful job with this interview, and I'm not throwing him under the bus, but I said to him, it sounds like you have some assumptions about what it means to be highly sensitive and what you think a highly sensitive person needs. And we have a really nice conversation about that. He also asks me about if a couple were to come to me and one of the partners was very sensitive, how would I work with that partner? I'll be really honest with you. I recorded this interview during the summer and I edited the episode in August when I was flying back from Podcast Movement. I usually listen to episodes before I release them. I listened to some parts of it today. I don't think I did a great job editing it. I'm really tired. I just want to get this episode out. That was Gracie sneezing. If you follow me on social media, on Facebook, in the closed and open page, Unapologetically Sensitive, I posted pictures of what I was doing today instead of producing this. Unfortunately, the podcast fairy did not show up and get this episode together for me. So I'm a little tired and depleted, and I just did not listen to the episode all the way through. But I do remember we had this conversation, and what we talked about is it's so easy to focus on the perceived identified patient being the highly sensitive person, but in a relationship, in a marriage, in a family, we need to look at the whole system and everybody has a part in it. And while it's easy for everybody to focus on the highly sensitive person, we're often the emotional glue that holds our relationships together. Sometimes we're in relationships with people that don't want to connect, that don't have the ability to be super emotional with us. And instead of the focus being on the whole system, that the HSP shows up this way, and in contrast, this is how the partner shows up, the focus is on the HSP. So if I recall, I think we do a really nice job of talking about that in this episode. There are a couple of other things. At the beginning of this episode, I tell Jeff that I'm tired, and then it sounds like I'm on crack. I don't do drugs. I wasn't on crack. And I talked to him about being tired, but what I realized is I'm a highly sensitive person. I'm a high sensation seeker. And for me, that means I love emotional connection and vulnerability. And often when I do these podcast interviews, I'm working at home alone by myself. I guess that's what alone means, huh? And I haven't been connected to anybody. So when I start an interview, it's like I've kind of been unplugged. And when I connect with someone, it's like you plug me in and I come to life. After I listened to this episode when it came out on Jeff's podcast, I had some shame because I sound like I'm manic. And if that's offensive to anybody, that's not my intention. So since this interview, when I do other interviews, I really try and rein it in because I do get so excited talking about the traits of being a highly sensitive person. But after Jeff and I ended the interview, I asked him, because I was kind of embarrassed, I said, Jeff, I feel like I talked too much and I didn't give you a chance to talk. And he was very kind and said it was fine. But I really did have a little bit of shame about how I show up in this episode. And the reframe is I get really excited and passionate. A couple of other things in this episode. Dara Hoffman-Fox, who's a gender therapist, was a guest on this podcast, episode 17, part 1 and 2, where we talked about what it is to be non-binary, what it is to be transgender, talking about how to use pronouns. And when this episode came out on Jeff's podcast, Dara was kind enough to reach out to me. And I give the statistic that 50% of men and women are highly sensitive. And what I didn't talk about, and I don't have any research about it, but I didn't acknowledge is I don't know what this statistics are if you're non-binary, if you're transgender. But I'm really working on being much more inclusive in my language. I see how often I say you guys instead of you people or hey there. Or I just heard something, what was it? Gals, guys, and non-binary pals. I saw Dara post that over the weekend. The other thing is that I talk about parents of highly sensitive people. And again, really just trying to be mindful about my language, that not everybody was raised with parents. Some people were adopted. Some people were in the foster care system. Some people lived with family, with relatives. And so again, I'm just trying to be more mindful of my language. And when I notice that I'm not being, I just like to bring it to your attention and call myself out. Let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. Jeff Guenther, LPC, is a therapist in Portland, Oregon. He's been in private practice since 2005. Jeff is the creator and owner of Portland Therapy Center, a highly ranked therapist directory. He also hosts a podcast called Say More About That, about trending mental health topics. Jeff has launched a new progressive therapist directory at Therapy Den that fights racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all other forms of discrimination. Sign up for a free profile at Therapy Den, and you can have a membership there. And Jeff has also added now that you can put what your pronouns are. It has all kinds of, I'm going to be messy with my language. It has all kinds of specifications if you're looking for someone who is non-binary or you want somebody who's transgender. He's really been incredibly inclusive and thoughtful in this directory. That's Gracie sneezing again. If you're a therapist, I would really suggest that you go sign up for a profile on Therapy Den. It's free. If you're enjoying the podcast, please share it. If you're open to rating and reviewing, I will try and remember to put notes in the show notes, directions on how you can rate and review. It gives the podcast credibility. It helps other people find it. And now, on to the show.
Hello.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm tired today, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy you're here too. And I'm also happy that you gave an honest answer that sort of fits your whole thing, your brand.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all about being okay to be however we are when we show up. Just because I'm tired today doesn't mean that I don't show up and do what I need to do. But I can say like, hey, I'm kind of depleted today and I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you're telling me. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the listeners?
My name's Patricia Young. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm really moving more into coaching right now. I specialize in working with highly sensitive people. Mm-hmm. I do some online groups for highly sensitive people too. And what I really want people to know is about the trait of high sensitivity. We have amazing strengths. I think culturally, we don't understand sensitivity. We want to shut it down. Highly sensitive people have internalized a lot of negative messages about what it means to be sensitive. Mm-hmm. And we have so many incredible gifts and strengths. And I really want to provide education and for people to really start seeing how much the world needs us and the wonderful contributions that we have to offer, to really come from a strengths-based perspective. Sensitivity provides challenges. There are other things that go with it. I mean, that's how life is. Nothing is 100% one thing. Mm-hmm. But I really want to take that shift from it's weakness, it's something bad, it's something to be ashamed about, to we have amazing superpowers to offer the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how you frame it as superpowers. That really does kind of like shift the way that we can think about it.
Yeah.
Just, like we've only been talking for a few minutes here, but I can already tell that you're just like really passionate about all of this stuff, highly sensitive people. How did you sort of like get into it?
In a very unusual way, a lot of what's been written about introversion really overlaps highly sensitive people. I would go on social media and see all these memes about introversion and thought like, oh, I'm an introvert. Mm-hmm. Well, the truth is I'm a highly sensitive extrovert. And I think a lot of people that relate to what we see about introversion is really about being a highly sensitive person. It's not a very exciting story. I don't even know how I found out about being a highly sensitive person, but I went to a retreat in Santa Cruz. And at that point, I realized that I knew so much more about the trait of high sensitivity without knowing about it. And just as highly sensitive people, we love learning information. We love learning about ourselves. Mm-hmm. 50% of clients in therapy are highly sensitive people. So those folks that show up on time, that pay their bills, that are conscientious, that do homework, that want to work, those are probably your highly sensitive folks. I thought I had social anxiety. I don't. Once I learned about the trait of high sensitivity, I thought I was an introvert. I'm a highly sensitive extrovert. So there's so much power in having information about what goes on with us and to reframe it, because I really thought like I'm an introvert and I'm socially anxious, so I'm not going to go to stuff. And that really didn't work for me. I needed more information. So I really want people to know. And it's really important for therapists to be able to recognize their highly sensitive clients, because I have therapists that are clients that come to me. And when a therapist doesn't know and they've got a highly sensitive client, they're trying to get them to get out and be more social or be more active or to be like the non-HSPs. It creates a rupture in therapy. So for those therapists, in order to have good client retention, you really want to be able to identify your highly sensitive clients and have a different way of working with them so that you meet their needs and that you've got better client retention.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think, I don't know if it was back and forth in an email or something before we started talking, but you mentioned that there can be sort of like a rupture in therapy if the if the therapist doesn't really realize that their client is highly sensitive. How can that rupture happen?
There are a couple of things. That highly sensitive people have a more active insula. We have more mirror neurons. I just had Esther Bergsma on. I'm not a researcher, so I always want to say where I got my information from because it's not mine. And what she was saying is that when a highly sensitive person has an interaction, like 20 parts of their brain light up, not literally. A non-highly sensitive person is going to have maybe 5 areas of their brain light up. So if you and I are having an interaction and you're my therapist, and I'm picking up something from you, and I don't know that I'm highly sensitive, I don't know to talk about it. You as a therapist haven't set the framework. Like for all my clients, I say like, I'm probably going to say or do something at some point that pisses you off. It's not intentional, but if that happens, please let me know. If you need to send me an email, if you're not aware of it in the moment, sometimes as highly sensitive people, we have an interaction, something doesn't feel right, and then we leave and we go home, we go like, what the heck? Or, conflict, it can be very challenging because it's uncomfortable, especially we have more empathy. So we imagine how the other person might feel hurt. So it can make communication really difficult. So if you are knowledgeable about the trait, you're going to do that front loading with your clients first to create safety. The second thing is, I have days like with you today, my energy is low. So if I had a client today, I would probably start out the session by saying, hey, I just want to let you know my energy is a little down today. It's very likely that my clients are going to pick up that I'm not showing up the way that I normally do. It creates safety. My clients are going to pick up on it. If we don't talk about it, they're going to think they're sharing something very intimate. There's a very good chance they're going to go like, oh my God, Patricia's judging me, or, maybe I had a bad lunch. Maybe had a really difficult session with a client before this one and I'm not talking about it. Maybe my panties are too tight today. I mean, we don't know. If we as clinicians are not aware of how we're showing up in the room and cannot bring that to our clients, our highly sensitive clients are going to pick up on it, whether they know that they're picking up on it or not. It's going to create a rupture. Or if we're not aware of the trait and we have a client that's telling us that they're anxious or they need to do something that's challenging, if we don't understand what they need, normalization, validation, education, then we do skill building. We're just going to try and get them to use CBT or to give them some tools or to try and get them to be like the other 80% of non-HSPs. Most people that are HSPs that don't know that they are learning about the trait, we've been told you're too sensitive, you're too dramatic, you cry too much, you worry too much, you think too much, you're too picky. We've internalized this stuff. And so if we have a therapist that we are looking to for support and we don't know any better, and we get some of that pushback from the therapist, it just reinforces that negative story and we leave feeling like there's something wrong with us. And I've had a number of therapists who've been in therapy for years, and only the very last therapist, we talked about being a highly sensitive person. It's really important as clinicians that we have this awareness so that we can identify our clients and really help them develop their strengths.
Yeah. No,
that's a long answer.
That is a long answer. But all really good points. And you said you were depleted, but you certainly don't sound depleted at the start of this interview.
This stuff fires me up.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, let's actually back up for a second. What makes someone an HSP? You mentioned that there can actually be like sort of like maybe brain scans done in order to see like how many parts are lighting up. Is that like one scientific way to sort of figure out like who is highly sensitive?
Let me give you does this work? Let me give you some of the brief statistics so that you kind of have an overlay. And then there are 4 core characteristics that make up what a highly sensitive person is. So is that a good starting place?
Sounds great.
Okay. Being a highly sensitive person, or HSP, it's an innate trait. So it's not due to trauma. It's not due to anything that's wrong. It's how we're born and wired. 50% of men are HSPs. 50% of women are HSPs.
Okay.
About 20%, Dr. Aaron says 15 to 20% of the population are highly sensitive. So about 80% are not. She suspects it may be higher. That's too high to be a disorder. It's too high to be something that's not helpful. And it's a survival instinct. They've identified about 100 animal species that are highly sensitive. Those are, like in horses, those are the ones that are going to notice if there's something going on. They're going to let the pack know that there's danger, that they need to do something. So again, we have this idea of sensitivity as being a weakness in the animal kingdom. It can really be an incredible strength. And the leaders are often the highly sensitive ones. Yeah.
Interesting.
And 70% of highly sensitive people are extroverts and 30% are introverts.
Really? I feel like that.
Did I say it backwards? Well, I think I did.
say it again so I can.
Okay.
You said 70% are extroverts.
No.
The other way around.
That was my mistake. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. My brain and my mouth often do not communicate really well. Let's rewind. Okay. 70% are introverts.
Got it.
30% are extroverts.
Okay. That makes, I guess,
and then there's
sense.
Yeah. And then there's high sensation seekers, which is not necessarily, if those folks are going to do skydiving and really daring things, those are the folks that are going to research. They're going to be the safest ones that are doing it. Like, I'm a high sensation seeker, but not physical. I don't like heights. I don't like that overstimulation. Like, I don't like that feeling. But on an emotional level, I mean, you notice I get fired up with talking about things that I care about and having emotional intimacy and doing risk taking emotionally. That's where my high sensation seeking comes up, and novelty, love novelty.
Wow.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yeah, that did a good job of explaining it. Or did you have something else to say about it?
No, there are 4 core characteristics.
Yeah, let's hear about
characteristics that Dr. Aaron identifies that really make up, like, if you want to know if you're a highly sensitive person, you want to look at these 4 core characteristics. Do you want to hear about them?
I'd love to.
So it spells the acronym DOES, or DOES, DOES. So D is for depth of processing. So the highly sensitive brain is, we have a more active insula, the part of the brain that helps enhance perception and increase self-awareness. So we're also wired to pause and reflect before we engage. So we're always taking in a lot of information. We think very deeply about it. Sometimes it takes more time to make decisions. This is where perfectionism can come up, because we want to make the right decision. We want to get all the information. We're deep thinkers. The O is for overstimulation or overarousal. Because we notice way more things in the environment, we're more impacted by social stimulation. So kind of like we talked about with the brain, you go into a room, if you're not highly sensitive, you notice 5 things, no big deal. I'm highly sensitive. I go into a room and I notice 20 things. It's, it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So it's not uncommon for highly sensitive people to have that sense of overwhelm. And for me, I think that belief of thinking that I had social anxiety, my guess is I probably went into situations that got over-aroused, overstimulated, didn't know what it was. It just felt yucky. And I knew I didn't want to do it again. Now that I know what it is, I know how to manage those things. I have tips and tools of how I can deal with certain things. But my guess is that many people who have situations that they just don't want to go back into, this is anecdotal on my part, but I think it's probably we got overstimulated, over-aroused. It felt yucky. I'm like, I don't want any more of that. But we don't know what it is because we don't talk about it. The E is for emotional responsiveness or empathy. So this is where brain scans have shown that HSPs have more active mirror neurons, which are responsible for feelings of empathy. We've got more activity in areas of the brain that are involved with emotional responses. So HSPs are going to be much more impacted by positive things than non-HSPs. And if you put us in a lousy situation, we're going to be more negatively impacted than a non-HSPs. So the good news is, in therapy, our HS clients have better outcomes than our non-HS clients.
Oh, okay, that's good.
And then the last one is awareness of subtle stimuli. So we notice details, nonverbal cues, small changes in the environment. We're going to be impacted by strong sensory smells, bright lights, loud noises, crowds, very sensitive to clothes and textures, seams and socks, labels, tight belts, all those things. So, it's why you're probably not going to find a lot of us at rock concerts, because that's a lot of stimulation for us. Not everybody, we're all individuals, so I don't want to put anybody into a box, but those are the 4 core characteristics. And if the listeners are interested, they can go to hsperson.com. There's a self-test that you can take. And if you suspect that you're highly sensitive and you take it and you don't score in the range, Dr. Aaron suggests to take the child version of the test. Think back to when you were a kid, what you heard about yourself, and take the child version of the test, because our culture doesn't really value sensitivity. So many of us have learned to block and cover up because that's what we needed to do to survive.
Yeah. When you said a little earlier that men and women are what, they're like equal on the amount of folks that are, that was, I don't know, surprising to hear, just because I figured like, oh, it's probably going to be like, mostly women that are going to be labeled as like highly sensitive.
Right.
Do you feel like maybe there's, I don't know what, if it's culturally or socially or something, that like women maybe are told that it's more okay for them to be sensitive, while men, even if they are like at the same amount a highly sensitive person, it's sort of like not okay, or it's not manly?
Yeah. I mean, I know that certain cultures, Thailand, really value sensitivity. And so they're more collective. And so it's something that's really more embraced. The US does not value sensitivity. And then, I mean, this is another rabbit hole, so we're not going to go down it. But if you look at gender roles and stereotypes, what are the messages that we give boys? And if you look at how our culture, like, highly sensitive people tend to respond very strongly to animals, to nature, to music, to dance, to the creative arts. Like, we're really moved by it. And I love watching dance shows. I can't tell you how many times I've seen on like America's Got Talent or World of Dance, where one of the judges will say like, it's okay, don't cry. Or, oh, you're being such a strong boy by not crying. What kind of a crazy message is that? You've got these young kids that are passionate about what they're doing and they don't win. You're supposed to be upset and disappointed and cry. Like, that's a really healthy, normal response. And so what I would really encourage the listeners to do is to start tuning in, because those messages are everywhere and they're damaging. They're powerful and they're really damaging.
Yeah, they are. When I first think of like a highly sensitive person, I think the first place I go to really try to kind of like understand it or conceptualize it, or even just kind of like check in with myself to see if I am, is I go to my 5 senses. Can I feel like really sensitive or overly sensitive or overwhelmed with all the 5 senses? But in the way that you're talking about it, it almost feels like there's also just sort of like this other part of it, like your intuition, or like there's like a 6th sense or something. So is it just your 5 senses, or is it even more than that?
Well, I always go back to Dr. Aaron's work. So being a deep thinker, do you feel things deeply?
Right.
Do you get overstimulated, overaroused in situations? Do you have a lot of empathy? Do you feel things deeply? We don't like sirens. We don't like scary movies in general. We don't like watching people get hurt. We don't like watching animals get hurt. Not everybody. And then what you're talking about is kind of the sensory stuff, which is only 1/4 of it. So you really need to look at all 4 aspects.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You also mentioned a little earlier that if high sensitivity isn't caused by trauma. Yeah. And then it got me thinking like, well, what if a child grows up in with parents that are alcoholics? You know how they can kind of like become maybe hypervigilant or hyper-focused on like, oh, my parent is acting this way, or they might be a little drunk, or they had 1 drink and this feels safe, or this doesn't feel safe. Do you think that can create like a more highly sensitive person?
Based on the research, no. There are a couple of things that before I knew I was highly sensitive, I had that theory. I grew up with a single parent that had rules about rules and was very anxious. And I really learned how to read the environment and how to meet people's needs. And so that was the story that I made up in my head about why I was that way. What the research shows is highly sensitive children that are raised in supportive environments don't have any negative outcomes. for those highly sensitive children that have difficult childhoods, they have higher rates of anxiety and depression. I would take it a step further. Again, I'm not a researcher. This is all anecdotal, but it makes sense. If you have a child that feels things deeply, is worried or is thinking about something, or somebody that's hurt, and they have a parent that's not sensitive to that. And that could be another highly sensitive parent who was not, their sensitivity wasn't honored. My mom is a highly sensitive person, but that wasn't honored. And so, I had to do a lot of therapy and rework on my own self to heal. So if a parent says, like, don't worry about it, why are you making a big deal about it? Don't cry. You're so sensitive. You're so picky. That's a way that we separate from our authentic self. A child depends on their parent for survival. A child doesn't have the ability to go like, my feelings are all okay, and my parent has some limitations.
Right.
The child adopts the parent's view and can disown those parts of themselves. That's going to create a break from our authentic self because it's adaptive and we need it for survival. Where that takes us later on, that's a whole other thing. So that doesn't, does that count for a difficult childhood? But I can see how that break from honoring our sensitivity, that kids learn about who we are from our parents, and our parents are supposed to teach us to self-regulate and how to soothe and to calm. And if we don't have that, then yeah, we probably are going to feel like we're too dramatic and we're too picky and we're too needy and we're too whatever. That's not a problem of the sensitivity. It's a break in the parenting, giving the child what they needed.
Sure, that makes sense. So if a child the child grows up in an environment with alcoholic parents, say, and they become more like vigilant or hyper-vigilant, hyper-focused on, that's something different. Or that can be something different than just someone who's like a highly sensitive person, right?
My guess is that for the highly sensitive kids that grow up in environments like that with an alcoholic parent, it probably keeps them alive. It's the kids that mouth off at the parents and can't comply and can't toe the line because they're not wired to. They're not picking up on those cues. They end up, again, I'm just guessing, probably have a harder time because they don't have that ability to take in and go like, oh, something's wrong with mom. I better zip it up tonight because if I don't, then there's going to be problems. So it really can be adaptive.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounds like you're talking about it in a way that children just sort of have different temperaments. When we're born into the world, we might have a temperament that's like more easygoing, slow to warm up, and then, well, I don't know, fussy or anxious. I forget what the other one is, but we have temperaments and that's how it is. And it's not really like passed down from like our DNA or from our parents. We just sort of like have it. And it sounds like either you're highly sensitive or you're not highly sensitive, kind of like how we have a certain temperament or we don't have a certain temperament.
Right. So there's nothing to fix. There's nothing that's broken. It's that wounding that gets overlaid and the negative messages that we get externally and then we internalize them, that's often where the healing needs to come. So often if people hate their sensitivity, there's a good chance that there's wounding there, and it's the wounding that needs to be taken care of first and then work on the trait of sensitivity, because there's also a really high, people are often misdiagnosed with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, ADHD, because of the high intensity of emotions and responses. And that's not really what's going on.
Yeah. Do you think that I think I know how you're going to answer this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Okay. If a highly sensitive person came into your office to see you as their therapist, do you think you would do you think you would treat them in a way where you would sort of like honor their sensitivity and let them know that they shouldn't feel shame or they shouldn't feel embarrassment or humility about it and bring it out kind of like it is a superpower? Or would you try to create some maybe like more resilience so that they didn't feel so overwhelmed or sensitive? Or would you do both maybe?
Well, it's interesting. When you sent me some questions ahead of time, that one of the questions had to do with resilience. And so, my question is do you see it as a weakness that needs to have resilience offered?
Yeah. And when I was asking you that question and I used that word resilience, I was like, she's going to pick up on that. And you should ask a question about it. Yeah, I think, personally, I don't think that it's a bad thing, or that people should like be strong, putting that in quotes, and like not be sensitive, or they should be more resilient or something. But I guess I'm sort of like being influenced by like our culture, like you've been pointing out, thinking that like, oh, if you're super sensitive, then maybe you should like practice some sort of like emotional resilience exercises or therapy in order to like fit better in our society. And as you're saying, that's probably not like the best message to give to somebody. But I guess my question is then, like, what if somebody does come in and they see it as a bad thing or something that's getting in the way, and they want to be quote unquote more resilient? Do you just try to kind of like empower them that like this is a good thing, an okay thing, there's nothing wrong with this, we shouldn't judge it? Or do you sort of like work with them to get that need met of being more resilient, I guess? Is there a better word for this? I don't want to keep on saying resilient, but less sensitive.
Well, let's look at it this way. Let's look at an HSP that doesn't have wounding. So the strengths of being an HSP are we're loyal, we're conscientious, we are the peacemakers, we're the healers, we show up on time, we're deep thinkers, we're great problem solvers, we make great partners and employers and parents and children, and we're great leaders because we listen and we take in a lot of information. So if you take that as those are the strengths of any HSP, whether they're wounded or not, and you see it as a strength. Now, if you have somebody that comes to you and they've got wounding, and really, Jeff, I think no matter who we are, we have these negative messages. You know, you're not doing enough. You should be smarter. You should be thinner. You should be making more money. If you only had a better car, if you, you know, whatever that stuff is, I think everybody has that. So you have an HSP that comes into therapy, whether they know they're an HSP or not. Once they learn about the trait, we need to provide education, validation, and normalization. There's nothing wrong with you. This is about how people responded to you. So first we provide education. There's nothing wrong with you. Then it's not uncommon that we don't know how to self-regulate, and we do have really strong responses to things. Then you do skill building, if that's what the client wants, on how do you manage these strong feelings that you have. And you know, I think I used to think that, you know, there was something wrong with me. I kind of confused gossiping and being judgmental. And the truth is we're very discerning. So I go into a situation, I'm picking up all kinds of information. So for me now, I just kind of identify, like, I go into judgment really easily about things, and I have very high expectations, and I get disappointed very frequently. And for years I was told that wasn't okay. That's just how I'm wired. And so I just came back from a retreat and kind of had this like namaste kumbaya experience. And I thought like, oh, I've arrived. I should know better. I talk about this all the time. And part of the depletion today is like, I'm kind of back to struggling with the things that I was struggling with before I went on this retreat. And I thought, I had this expectation that like I got connected to myself and now life is going to look really different. Oh, it's that expectation, disappointment thing again. Okay, so what do I need to do today? I need to slow down. So there's a way that we don't have to change it. We don't have to fight it. We just know like, oh, I had an expectation. I didn't realize it. And then we work with it. So I think that as we learn about our traits, we learn about how we respond, and I mean, the self-compassion, I think, is huge. Having gentleness, because I think we have a reaction and then we judge the reaction, then we judge that we're judging the reaction, and then that just creates suffering. So, yeah,
that's a good answer. I think maybe I was asking like, and you answered it. I think in your answer there is like, do you? Instead of saying resilience, I might say like self-regulation. And it sounds like that's something that you talk about. And
I'd say self-compassion, because I think that when we come from a place of loving and embracing whatever it is that we struggle with, then, I mean, life is going to give us all kinds of stuff. And it's really about the ability to embrace and accept whatever's going on, to move through it. That will lead us to times of bliss and whatever else we need.
Right. Yeah. I feel like, you know, I see individuals and I see couples as well. And sometimes when my couples come in, do you see couples or just individuals?
I don't.
You don't? Yeah. When my couples come in, a lot of times there's like a more highly sensitive person and then not. And the person who's more highly sensitive is the one that's like the identified patient. They're being needy and they're being too anxious and they're always wanting to talk and like check in about our relationship. If they would just like chill and go with the flow, then like everything would be okay. It also kind of turns out that like not all the time, but like the majority of the time, it's like the woman who's more like highly sensitive. And then the man is sort of like stereotypically, I don't know, a little avoidant or not as tuned in or tapped into their emotional experience or something. And it's sad and it's unfortunate. And the woman has, it seems like, or in this case, in this example, she's been getting these messages her whole life. That this person who's like highly sensitive isn't okay, and they're like too overwhelming to be in a relationship with. So then you see this person, whether they're in a couple or an individual, and there's like a lot of reprogramming almost that needs to go on, so they don't feel so much shame or guilt and feel really bad about their sensitivity. But it's hard because like the other person in the relationship who's not highly sensitive, it's really difficult to kind of like explain to them, this is what it's like to have a life, to like be somebody that's highly sensitive and like live in this reality. And they can be maybe sometimes all the way on the other end of the spectrum and just be like, well, why can't you just be more like me? And there's even like movies, right, where we'll watch like movies about like the brave person who's like gone out on their own and they're not affected by anything, and they're like traveling the world, or they don't need anybody or something, where we put this sort of, they're like this brave person that isn't affected by emotions or like the sensitive world or something. So we kind of like prize that person as well, who maybe isn't like as overwhelmed. I don't know. I just think that it's always like a really tricky thing when I have that couple in my office where there's like a highly sensitive person who's being like shamed as really needy, but they're the actual glue that's keeping the relationship together. And if it wasn't for them, there probably would be no relationship at all. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, what came up for me when you were talking is it's not uncommon that if in your family you were the disruptor, the black sheep, there's a good chance that you're the highly sensitive person, because we're truth tellers. We see things and we name what we see. But it's interesting, even when you were talking about the couple, I got a really negative sense about the identified highly sensitive person. It's like, well, is the other partner emotionally available? What's their attachment style? How are they showing up? And so kind of like you said, that this, there was a mutual attraction there. And it's not that the highly sensitive person is the issue. And if they stop doing all those things, then where do you think all the other problems would be showing up, in the other partner? Yeah. So if you're listening and you're highly sensitive, I really want you to know that it's a great strength, and that, we choose people that we need to grow with, or there's something there.
Yeah. And I feel like you see this with like children and families sometimes when the child is the identified patient, and there's always, they're the one that's doing something wrong. They're the one that's disrupting everything, when really there's nothing wrong with them at all. They may just be sort of like observing everything and taking everything in and maybe feeling overwhelmed by it. But it's like the system that they're in that needs, the family system that they're in, that needs to be addressed.
Right. Usually you're a highly sensitive person, like highly perceptive. I always ask my guests, like, what's another name you would want to use? Like highly perceptive comes up, or highly responsive, because we pick up on all kinds of things, and it's a strength. Not if you're in a system, look at The Emperor Has No Clothes. That's kind of a perfect example of everybody's in this thing. Oh, he looks great. And the guy has no clothes on. And one kid says, like, the guy is naked. That's what it's like to be a highly sensitive person sometimes.
Yeah. It almost seems like you're talking about it in this way. I'm maybe kind of projecting this onto it, but that like the more highly sensitive person is more evolved. I don't know. Would you say that they are?
I'm really reluctant to say things that feel like there's a judgment in them. That's just kind of one of my personal values. I think that we can have very high emotional intelligence. I think we're very in tune. We're very intuitive. I know in my family, it's funny that you said it, like I'm the glue that holds my family together. And that's very common for highly sensitive people. I guess it comes with challenges, and we have so many strengths. And I think just to focus on that, we have strengths and gifts. And when we get messages from other people that we're two, it's often somebody else's projection. It has nothing to do with us, but we haven't taught the skills and we haven't learned the skills to get really curious about, well, what does that mean to you if I'm too sensitive or I cry too much? What does that bring up for you? It's not about me. It's about you have a really low intolerance for me showing my feelings. It makes you really uncomfortable.
You said earlier at the beginning of this talk that you're a highly sensitive person, and then you're also someone who seeks
high sensation seeker.
A high sensation seeker. Yeah. Can you say more about that? What is a high sensation seeker?
There's not an awful lot that I can say. If you go to hsperson.com and you look for HSS or high sensation seeker, there's an article there. If you look up Caroline Ferguson, she lives in the UK. And in August, I'm just running through my Rolodex in my brain. I just interviewed her for the podcast, and she is doing work with high sensation seeking. And so sometime in August, I'm looking right now, around August 20th, her new website will be up. And this is something that she's really looking into. So it's kind of like we have a need for novelty, for thrill, for excitement. It can either be your typical skydiving. We're going to be very cautious about it. For me, it's very emotional. Things that are repetitive, doing the same thing over and over again is a little challenging for me. Like I kind of like new things. I like fun. I like stimulation. That kind of gets me revved up. And so if we have that aspect, it's important to know about it. So if we're in a situation where we have to do the same thing over and over, how do we create some novelty or stimulation, or just know like sometimes we chop wood and carry water. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever, this is sort of a random question, do you watch the show The Bachelor or The Bachelorette?
I've seen snippets of it, but not a lot.
It's one of my like all-time favorite guilty pleasure shows. Okay. And you probably kind of like know the premise. There's like a bachelor, bachelorette, and there's 25 to 30 other people of the opposite sex of, that they kind of like go on dates with, and they get voted off and yada, yada. Eventually you get to your one person and they get engaged and married and live happily ever after. Well, that's what they are trying to go for. It doesn't usually happen. But when I'm watching the show, it almost seems like all the folks that are on the show are like, that are maybe like highly sensitive people, and also like seeking a lot of like just sort of big, overwhelming experiences. Because on the show, they go on dates, but they don't just go on dates. They go traveling abroad. They like go cave diving. They go bungee jumping. And you can tell that they're like feeding off of it. That this is just, they love it. It's amazing. They go on stage and do stand-up comedy, or they go into different cultures. And it's just like incredibly overly stimulating. And while they're doing this with the person, with the bachelor or the bachelorette, they're also falling in love. So like, and they're kind of like, the producers are deliberately trying to get like the adrenaline going and the endorphins going. And when you're bungee jumping with somebody, just this season, they went bungee jumping naked, which is like, yeah, I don't know. It's, yeah, you're kind of rolling your eyes, and you should. But I'm
just thinking about body parts kind of flopping all over the place because I'm not young anymore.
Well, interestingly, what they did is like, the bachelorette and her date, they like smushed their bodies together like they were hugging. And so they're hugging and holding each other, and then they just fall off the side. And anyways, so much overstimulation the whole time. And it seems like all the people are just like eating it up. And then eventually they pick their one person at the end, and then they get married, or they get engaged, hopefully get married. And then they go home, and they're not on the reality show anymore. And they're back to their boring lives that are just normal and mundane, and isn't filled with all of these like high, intense activities. And a lot of times like the relationship just sort of like falls apart. And I wonder if it's just because they're not getting, maybe they're like highly sensitive people. Maybe they're like seeking out all these like really amazing, overwhelming experiences. And then when they leave them, they might just feel depressed, or they might feel like down, or they might not feel as in love as they were before. Anyways, I'm bringing this up just because like if you are somebody who is seeking out experiences that brings you a lot, and then all of a sudden you go home to your regular life, is there like a feeling of grief? Do you start to feel depressed? Do you start to like question how important or powerful the experience was that you just came from?
Well, again, this is anecdotal. Yeah. I'm thinking as a highly sensitive person, like that sounds like a lot of overstimulation for me. Like that does not sound like a good time to me. Me personally, I don't know that that's something that I personally would really want to do. Mm-hmm. If you take the highly sensitive person out of it, like, being in love is exciting. Those endorphins, people can be addicted to falling in love. And then you add that high sensation seeking, not in terms of being a highly sensitive person, but just a lot of stuff that's going to give you more endorphins. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially if you're bungee jumping naked, holding someone, I think I would imagine that our brain's going to pair stuff together. And then, you go back to regular life. You haven't learned how to show up when you feel tired and depleted and you've got bad breath and you're not fully made up. So that doesn't feel like that's really the most solid foundation to get to know somebody, but
no, and it all
not how I would do it.
No, yeah, it all happens within 2 months too. So you have to like find your person in just like 8 weeks.
I mean, it takes us at least 6 months to a year to get to know somebody, not being on TV and bungee jumping and doing all these amazing things. So this is my judgment, but like that kind of sounds like a little bit of a setup.
It does.
Good TV, but for a solid relationship, not so sure.
Yeah. Weirdly, it's not good TV because the episodes are 2 hours long. So there's a lot of just sort of like, well, I'm not going to talk about The Bachelor because I'm going to save that for another episode. Anyways, I wanted to start to kind of like wrap up a little bit. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your podcast and tell me about like certain like topics or types of interviews that you do so that people can kind of like learn about it a little bit more.
Sure. So I have bonus episodes, which are me just getting on and talking about things that are incredibly vulnerable. And I've had a number of episodes I've recorded. I'm like, oh my gosh, should I release it? Because it feels really vulnerable. Those are usually the most popular episodes. I really... I think shame can make us feel like we're not okay. That whole sense of, if I really showed you who I am, that you would not want to be around me. And what I know is that shame needs secrecy to survive. And when we allow people to see the parts of us that feel messy and not perfect, and we're afraid people are going to leave, that's usually when we get the strongest connection with people. And so I really practice mirroring and modeling vulnerability and authenticity. I mean, I'm always very mindful about what I share and how much I share, but I'm pretty vulnerable about the things that I struggle with because I may know a lot about being a highly sensitive person. I get triggered. I just did an episode about my husband. I dropped his dry cleaning off at the dry cleaners and he asked me to just drive around the block. And my husband's over 6 feet. I'm 5'5". I didn't want to move the seat. So, I can barely reach the gas pedal and he put the emergency flashers on. I couldn't figure out where to turn them off. And I called him. He didn't pick up his phone. Like, I got really worked up and upset. And then he got back in the car and then like I was upset that I was upset. And this is on the heels of just releasing an episode about like, when you get overwhelmed and overstimulated, like lean into it and breathe. And, I had this, now I'm feeling like I'm a fraud because I just released this episode about how to manage. And now I'm like really worked up. It's the stuff that we go through. And I really want to model that and normalize it and validate it. So they're bonus episodes. And then the other episodes are weekly episodes that last an hour. I do interviews. So we've done narcissism, the childhood emotional neglect, CEN. I've done 4 episodes on it because there's really a very high overlap. And again, this is anecdotal, but I really think that a child having a parent that's not highly sensitive is enough to create childhood emotional neglect. So we talk about that. Debbie Reber was on. She does tilt parenting. She's got a child who's on the spectrum. So we've talked about parenting. I just had someone who's an empath on. So we talked about what's the difference between being a highly sensitive person and an empath. Had people from all over the world. So I really try and pick topics and people that I think are going to be of interest to the listeners. And we have really heartfelt, in-depth conversations. There are questions that I ask everybody along the lines of, is there another name for being a highly sensitive person? What's something that somebody told you that was really hurtful? What would you want to say to them? Do you play? Is play easy or hard? What would you want to tell your younger self? The feedback that I've gotten is it's really impacted people in their lives. And I just want to illuminate being human and being messy and being vulnerable and seeing what our strengths are and learning ways to manage mindfulness. We do a lot of talk about mindfulness, self-compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're doing a really good job getting that message out. And you're also a good talker and storyteller. So
I have to say, every time after I answer a question, like my gremlins are going like, you just can't be brief about anything. Cause it's like, I get really passionate. So that's how my gremlins show up, that I feel like I should, give you 3 sentences and stop. I'm like, I just love talking about this stuff. And thank you for sharing to my gremlins.
Yeah, no, you're good at talking about it. So I can listen forever. Again, can you tell people where they can find you or your website and what you're offering?
Sure. If you go to unapologeticallysensitive.com, everything's there. I do some online groups internationally for HSPs. We talk about boundaries, perfectionism, self-care, figuring out what your superpowers are, demystifying emotions. I don't know, there are 10 modules. I can't remember what they all are. We'll be starting them up again. I say we. I'm co-facilitating with Jen Perry right now, but I think we'll be doing our own groups. But I often say we. I'm like, there's a mouse in my pocket. I don't know the imperial we. So those will be starting up in September. And then I do online coaching with people internationally, just around learning what our strengths are with being an HSP, relationship issues, all kinds of stuff.
And are you accepting clients right now?
I am.
You are?
I am.
So they can find you on your website if they wanted to be a client. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for being with me and talking about this. I find it like super fascinating, and I think a lot of other people will too.
One last thing. So if you're a therapist and you want to learn more, I would go to Elaine Aron's website. She has the book, The Highly Sensitive Person. She has a book called Psychotherapy and the Highly Sensitive Person. If you're a therapist and you want to get trained to be listed as an HS knowledgeable therapist, there are some things that you can do. You can go to the website. If you're someone who's looking for a highly sensitive, knowledgeable therapist, you can go again to hsperson.com, and they've got therapists and coaches and practitioners that are all HS knowledgeable. So if you think you're highly sensitive and you want to work with somebody, you don't want to work with me, Google it, search for it, interview your therapist or your practitioner, because it really does make a difference in how people respond to you.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's important.
Yeah.
Okay, it was good talking to you. And
thanks so much, Jeff.
Yeah, no problem. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey there. So I'm curious to know what you thought about that. Was that helpful? Did it sound like I was too amped up? If I did, it is what it is. I really enjoyed this interview. I really want people to be educated about the trait of being an HSP and to see the amazing strengths that we have. I'm going to play a clip for you now that is from Pete Childs, who is a participant who just took the online HSP course. Pete wasn't sure if he was highly sensitive when he took the course. At the end of it, he's still not sure. His wife happened to take the course, and she says they're not sure, but he's incredibly empathic. And I'm sharing this with you because I had a few people that weren't sure if they were highly sensitive when they took the course, but what they said is they got really important skills from it. So here's a little bit of a clip from Pete about his experience taking the online HSP course.
Patricia, you also consistently modeled in the class. If you were having your taskmaster was pushing you to do something, or you just shared whatever was going on with you, and that's great modeling. Well, a quick piece of feedback, Patricia, is that it's not that you didn't do it enough. The best overall thing to come out of the group was just the continual coming back to focusing on self-care. It's just always so good for me to get reminders along those lines. Having you model self-care in the videos and, in the middle of class by just kind of talking about where you're really at. I guess I just kind of feel like, just more of that, just more of that. It's because I just always need examples are always helpful.
If you're interested in taking the online HSP course, you can go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. There's a tab for the HSP groups. Right now, as I record this, I'm adding to the website over the weekend. Hopefully, by the time you hear this, it will be fixed. But part of it is a really big hot mess right now, and there's supposed to be stuff there, and it's not looking exactly the way that I want to. Hopefully, that will be squared away. But there are videos there, interviews that I've done with folks who have taken the course. There are little audiograms like this one from Pete there. And there's something else, I can't remember what it is. There is an early bird special if you're listening to this in live time that will be good until December 15th, 2019. The online courses will begin the week of January 12th, 2020. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I hope that this holiday season is going smoothly. And if it's not, I hope that you're just having radical self-acceptance. I know this time of year can be really challenging for many, many people. For many, it's not a joyous season. There's grief and loss and sadness. So whatever's going on, I hope that you find little pockets of joy, that you find a blanket of comfort to wrap yourself in. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.